Welcome all, and thank you for joining us today for one of our international webinars going to the People's Climate Summit in Antalya, which will be held in parallel with COP31 in November. I would like to thank all our participants who are on different time zones, either waking up early or giving up their much needed rest to be here. And I'm really grateful for our translators, Eren and Müge. Waking up early today to be with us is Max Wilbert. Good morning and welcome, Max. Max Wilbert is a writer, organizer, activist, and a wilderness guide. He is author of several books, including Bright Green Lies, How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way and What We Can Do About It, which Vandana Shiva called a much-needed wake-up call. Max has been part of grassroots political movements for 20 years, taking direct action to halt fossil fuels and most recently launching a campaign to stop a lithium mine. I think it's called Tracker Pass. He writes the newsletter Biocentric on Substack, and his work often appears in alternative media. He is now working for a master's degree in degrowth. He was fined $49,000 for protesting, and he is also working to defend old growth forests in Oregon. Currently, I'm reading the Bright Green Lies, and it's definitely an eye-opening. Many of the participants today of the webinar are activists, and they are taking part in the struggles against destruction of the nature, protecting the forest, watersheds, etc. But when it comes to the solutions, we may be confused as to the concepts such as sustainability, green energy, recycling, circular economy, and greenwashing. Now, I would like to ask Max, how can you share your point of view on these concepts and what we can expect in next generation industrialism in that respect? Thank you.
Good evening, good morning, everyone. Hi, thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you, Naisha, for the introduction and the invitation to speak. Naisha has shared with me a little bit about some of the battles that Turkish environmentalists have been involved in recent years, and I can only send my solidarity to all of you who've been involved in those fights. They sound like difficult battles, as we're facing here where I live in the Western United States. It's occupied indigenous territory of the Kalapuya people. So as Naisha said, my name is Max Wilbert. I've been involved in this work for a couple decades now. And this is a climate-focused conference, so I want to briefly mention my background in this topic specifically, mostly to establish that I'm not a plant of the fossil fuel industry. So let me share this screen here. So I have been following global warming and the serious crisis that it represents since about 2002, I think. I studied the science of global warming in college, and I ended up going on a climate science expedition to the Siberian Arctic. At the time, the US and Russia had more open relationships than they have currently. But I went to the Arctic with a climate science expedition to study, to document the work that the scientists were doing, looking at carbon cycles in the Arctic. I interviewed some of the world's top Arctic climate scientists for a short film I made on global warming in the Arctic. And I've also been involved in quite a bit of direct action against fossil fuels and fossil fuel infrastructure. Here are some pictures from those actions, blockading coal trains, stopping tar sands mining in the US state of Utah, participating in resistance to pipelines, kayaking out to stop oil rigs going up to the Arctic. And I share this because I think, as everyone who's here agrees, global warming is a massive crisis. And I think that is why we can't rely on green technology to save us, because it's not working. Um, I have a great deal of respect for climate scientists, for climate activists, especially those who uh, are not simply raising awareness, but are also taking action to try to change the course of the future. But the thesis that I'm going to share with you all here is really simple. I think that renewable energy, electric vehicles, and similar green technologies like this represent an extremely dangerous distraction for our movements. I think they're leading us in the wrong direction. And I'd like to explain why. So, in 1979, the Islamic Revolution took place in Iran, and global oil prices doubled. So here's a map of global energy use, or a chart rather, of global energy use. And if you can see this little dip, sort of midway between 1950 and 2000, there's a little dip. That's the 1979 oil crisis. And the US president at the time was Jimmy Carter. And people may not know this from around the world, but he, in response to the oil crisis, he lowered speed limits across the country. He installed solar panels on the White House, and he held a press conference. Famously, he was wearing a sweater, and he was encouraging people turn down your heaters in your house to save energy. So at that time, if you run the numbers, fossil fuels provided about 80.6% of global energy use. 80.6%. So just about 4/5 of global energy use. As of the most recently available data, which is from last year from the Statistical Review of World Energy, the amount of global energy that came from fossil fuels was 86.2%. 86.2%. So in 1979, it was 80.6%, and now it's 86.2%. And as you can see, the amount of energy that's being used has skyrocketed in that time. So both in terms of a percentage, fossil fuels make up a bigger percentage, and in terms of the absolute usage, we have, more than twice as much fossil fuels being burned today as in 1979. And what this tells us, again, he installed solar panels on the White House. People have been working on renewable energy since before 1979, obviously. But what this shows is that despite more than half a century of efforts to use renewable energies to get off fossil fuels and reduce our carbon footprint, it's not working. Our progress has actually been negative. It's going in the wrong direction. And I think this is somewhat predictable. Here's the problem that I have with this whole approach. The idea that green energy, green technologies will make industrial modern societies sustainable is, some of you may remember the scientist Carl Sagan. He used to say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that renewable energy can make our modern industrial society sustainable is an extraordinary claim, and it requires extraordinary evidence. And that evidence doesn't actually exist. So what I mean by that is that the idea of a sustainable modern industrial society powered by renewable energy is entirely theoretical. It doesn't actually exist in the real world. It exists in people's imaginations. It exists in some computer models. It exists in some academic papers. but it does not exist in the real world. What actually exists in the real world is this, is ecological collapse that's ongoing. It's the species extinction crisis. It's the loss of old growth forests. It's the fact that 40% of all human deaths are estimated to be due to pollution, and so on and so on. If you're watching this, I'm sure you know these numbers already. I don't have to tell you this. But again, in the real physical world, all the evidence is pointing in one direction. It's telling us that industrial civilization is not and can almost certainly never be sustainable. All these problems are not only occurring, but they're accelerating. They're getting worse over time. Everything is headed in the wrong direction. And I think this is going to continue into the future. There are a lot of people who've been pointing out the problems with renewable energy for a long time. And many of them have been ignored within the environmental movement and within the climate movement because it's not convenient. Their message is not convenient. It's not easily digestible. It's not good news for a lot of people. One person, for example, who's been critiquing renewable energy's potential to rapidly scale down our carbon emissions is Vaclav Smil, who's an energy expert, a scientist. He's written dozens of books on energy and industry. And he called the idea that we can rapidly use renewable energy to reduce carbon emissions, quote, the academic equivalent of science fiction. And I had a friend who recently wrote to Vaclav Smil to ask him about the Green New Deal, about 100% renewable energy, and so on. And his response was this. He said, quote, please just leave me out of this. I am done with American delusions of everything. We are dealing with people who, despite receiving relevant education, refuse to acknowledge basic physical and mathematical facts. That a global decarbonization is impossible by 2030 or 2040 is beyond any reasonable dispute. I don't share this information with any sense of happiness with you. If I'm laughing, it's out of discomfort with the situation, because I'm challenging something that a lot of people very deeply believe to be true, that renewable energy represents the solution to the ecological crisis that we're facing. There are other people who've worked on this issue as well. For example, the company Google, back when they actually had a climate change unit focused on solving climate change, they had a laboratory dedicated to it. And they eventually closed that lab. And their conclusion was, quote, even if every renewable energy technology advanced as quickly as imagined, and they were all applied globally, atmospheric CO2 levels wouldn't just remain above 350 parts per million. They would continue to rise exponentially due to continued fossil fuel use. So that was a lab of, Stanford educated PhDs and climate scientists telling us over a decade ago that renewable energy technologies, even applied as rapidly as possible, will not solve global warming. So, what does all this mean? This is what most of the climate movement is betting on. So this is a slide that I borrowed from a gentleman whose name I forget, so apologies to him if he's watching. But this is our energy use over time. And what you see on the right side of this image is this green shape here that says magic goes here. This is what most of the climate movement is betting on. And even if you look at the IPCC, increasingly they're betting on untested, unproven, non-scalable technologies like mass carbon capture and removal from the atmosphere because they know that renewable energy and electric vehicles are not nearly enough to address this crisis. They're betting on something that doesn't even exist. Not even in testing has this been able to work at scale, carbon capture and storage. Uh, this is a big, big problem. This is a big problem. And what it means, as many of you probably know, is that we're committed to likely at least 2.5 degrees Celsius warming, probably a great deal more than that. 3 degrees, 4 degrees, depending on how things play out in coming years. That means hundreds of millions, potentially billions of people dying, not to mention the effects on human life. I'm very, very frightened of this future. The other lie that plays into this is the lie that renewable energy technologies are good for nature and communities, that they're good, that they're supportive of nature and communities. There was a study published in the journal PLOS One a number of years ago. I think it was in 2019 or 2020. I can share the citation with anyone. Apologies, I don't have that handy. That showed that solar and wind energy development could be the #1 cause of habitat destruction by the year 2050. So they found that by 2050, solar and wind development threatened to destroy as much land as urban sprawl, oil and gas, coal, and mining combined in that period. Renewable energy is not good for the natural world. It relies on mining. We're talking about large-scale industrial projects, bulldozers, chainsaws, clear cutting of forest, and the installation of major industrial facilities. Just a few quick examples of that. Many environmentalists are promoting that we build around 19 terawatt hours of wind power. That amount of wind energy would kill 100 million birds a year and about 250 million bats per year. And it would drive certain bat species extinct. This isn't to get into many of the other issues with renewable energy technologies, electric vehicles, and other similar things. The mining that they require, excuse me, whether you're talking about rare earth mining in China and Madagascar, iron ore mining in Brazil and Finland, bauxite mining in India and Jamaica, copper mining in the United States and Chile, nickel mining in Indonesia and Russia, coltan mining in the DRC. If you look into those supply chains, you will find stolen land, destroyed ecosystems, neocolonialism, virtual slave labor in some cases, pollution, exterminated wildlife. It's not a pretty picture. And of course, people are standing up to this. So this is a list of, you probably can't even see this. I had to make the text very small. Apologies. This is the list of 22 communities which are fighting renewable energy projects or mining to supply the raw materials for renewable energy and electric vehicles around the world. And this is not an exhaustive list. There are far more than this. You have indigenous people in Colombia fighting industrial wind energy development. You have people in Nevada fighting industrial scale solar energy. You have lithium miners in Portugal using counterinsurgency techniques on the local population to push through destructive lithium mining. You have Chinese corporations poisoning entire rivers and landscapes in occupied Tibet for mining for lithium and other materials. Many other examples. And this is why the whole idea of a just transition really infuriates me in some ways. Because where are the minerals going to come from? Where is it okay to blow up mountains? Where is it okay to poison the water? Where is it okay to destroy traditional communities? Where is it okay to poison people and displace people and further degrade the ecology of this planet? Where is it okay? And I ask people this, tell me, where is it okay? People like Bill McKibben, I've challenged him directly, and he sidestepped the question because the truth is the technologies that he promotes are very destructive in a similar way to fossil fuel extraction. Yes, they are lower carbon. They have lower carbon intensity compared to in relation to the amount of energy they produce. But that does not mean they are good for the planet. And it doesn't mean they are good for the communities where they're sited. So what does it all, let me try and bring this together here. What does it mean that these technologies have become core to the climate movement, that they've become core to environmentalism? To me, it means that our movement has been co-opted. It means that what was once a movement for saving the planet, for saving rivers and forests and grasslands and wildlife, and saving a healthy and functional climate that we all rely on, has turned into a movement for saving industrial society by producing energy in massive quantities through an alternative to fossil fuels. So the system that turns an old growth forest into logs and into commodities, that's the same economic system. It's the same philosophical system of belief that wants to build millions of skyscraper-sized wind turbines and solar arrays to power the growth of industrial society. So my conclusion from all this is that renewable energy and other green technologies aren't a solution. They are not a solution. They are a form of industrial development that's just as destructive as fracking or coal mining. And I think it's a fundamental mistake to view these technologies as different from fossil fuels, as different from the industrial economy as a whole, because they emerge from that economy and they support that economy. They're the same. And some people like Alexander Dunlap, who's an academic who's written a bunch of papers on this topic, which are worth reading, if you ask me, he calls renewable energy technologies fossil fuels plus. Fossil fuels plus, because you can't build solar panels or electric vehicles or wind turbines without fossil fuels. And this chart just shows the similarities between these different technologies, basically how they're almost exactly the same in terms of their effects on the planet. The only difference in this whole chart here is you'll notice under pollution, for fossil fuels, it says pollution is often visible at the site of consumption. And then under green technologies, it says pollution is often invisible at the site of consumption. There's no smoke coming out of the smokestack or the tailpipe of an electric car, but that doesn't mean the pollution is not happening. It just means you can't see it. So the obvious question after all this becomes, if green technology isn't going to save us, if that's not the path to addressing the climate crisis and emerging in some way into a better future, then what is? What path should we take instead? So I want to share a story here. This is Thacker Pass, which Naisha mentioned in my introduction. This place is called Pahimaha in the indigenous Paiute language. And it's the site of a open pit lithium mine that's currently being built over this entire landscape shown here. So in 2021, I set up a protest camp here and worked for years to defend this place. We fought very hard. We spoke to the media. We participated in permitting and public debates. We used pressure campaigns against politicians. We held rallies. We worked with local indigenous tribes and filed lawsuits against the project. And eventually we took direct action to try and halt the mine. We were climbing on top of equipment, blocking roads, setting up protest camps in the middle of their construction site. We should call them destruction sites, not construction sites, as far as I'm concerned. And in the end, we failed. Our fight failed. We were fined by the federal government. We were sued by the mining company, slandered by the mainstream media, attacked by people who should be our allies. We were threatened with violence. We had guns pulled on us. Some people were arrested. And now this place that you see in this photograph right here is being bulldozed to make millions of electric cars, which are a luxury good. I should just point out, electric cars are not necessary for our life or our happiness or our flourishing. Electric cars are a luxury good. So this place is being destroyed to make a luxury good for General Motors Corporation, the car company. And one night, I was sitting up there at the protest camp. I was sitting around the fire with some elders from the Fort McDermott, Paiute, and Shoshone tribe, the local indigenous people. And one of the elder ladies turned to me and she said, you know, one day all this modern stuff is going to be gone. The electric grid is not going to be here anymore. The cars aren't going to be here. The grocery stores aren't going to be here. It's all going to collapse. And she said, when that time comes, the only thing that will matter to us and our people is whether there is water that we can drink and there is land that we can gather food on, like we did before. And that story, I think, has more wisdom than all the mainstream reports from big environmental organizations that are telling us that we can transition to 100% renewable energy within the next 10 or 15 years and avert the climate crisis. That woman who has no education, who grew up very poor in a very rural, remote area, you know, hunting deer and gathering food, gathering medicines, you know, living within a few generations of colonization. That story, I think, has more to tell us about the future direction of our movement than all of the mainstream climate organizations do. The definition of unsustainable is that it won't last, right? It cannot last. It will collapse. Many civilizations throughout history have collapsed, and they collapsed because they were not sustainable. And I think that when that collapse of industrial modern society occurs, the natural world, certainly in the long term, will be better off. And I think future humans will be better off because we rely, again, on that water. We rely on land. We rely on the plants and the phytoplankton creating the oxygen that we breathe every day. We rely on the land for everything. These are some wildlife photos I took at Thacker Pass. So the home of all these creatures has now been destroyed. These particular creatures who you see here are either dead or they have had to flee for their lives, for lithium mining, for electric cars. So it's not abstract, right? The harm to the natural world is not abstract. It's not just a story, it's a physical reality. And this leads me to the direction that I think our movements need to go. The modern environmental movement was once a revolutionary force that self-consciously saw itself in opposition to the spread of industrial civilization around the world and saw itself working in solidarity with the natural world, with all these creatures here, with the water, in solidarity with the forests, with the grasslands, and in solidarity with traditional communities who still live in alignment, in balance with the natural world. Communities who don't rely on industrial energy and don't rely on electric vehicles and don't rely on all the other earth destroying technologies of globalization and imperialism. I think we need to return to those roots. So this is what I say is this is what I believe is our generational work, and it's what I've been doing for the last almost 20 years now, trying to build a political resistance movement to defend our planet, trying to push back against this greenwashing, because I think, again, it is leading us in the wrong direction. Um, as Arundhati Roy has said, real resistance has real consequences, and there will always be wonderful reasons to not resist. But I think in this time, we need to have courage. We need action. We need people to be bold. We need to confront the reality that as we sit here talking, the oil refineries are still working, the pipelines are still flowing, the chainsaws are still buzzing around the world, cutting down forests. The mines are destroying mountains. More concrete is being laid every single day, more roads being built, more grasslands plowed up. And that's what my message is to you all today, and that's the message that I hope you can walk away with. It's not an easy message, but I think that there is a freedom that comes from letting go of delusions, from letting go of the idea that industrial society can be sustained, that renewable energy is the right path forward, and that through that magic that I showed earlier, we're somehow going to find our way out of this crisis. I don't think that's the case. I think we're only going to get out of this crisis by directly stopping the flow of fossil fuels, by directly stopping the mines, the logging projects, the destruction of our planet in all the different ways that it happens. And I think that green technology is only leading us astray from that focus on those issues. So thank you everyone for listening. From what I understand, we're going to do Q&A and discussion now. I'd really love to hear anyone's comments or thoughts or challenges. And I appreciate you all taking the time to listen to me.
Thank you. Çok teşekkürler, Max. Now we are open for the questions, and so please either write in the comments or you can raise your hand to ask your question directly. I will use my position as the moderator to ask the first question. So you said we need people to act. We need more people. When we hear about these destruction and all these what's happening in ecological collapse and everything, and many people um, are afraid, as you said. You said that you are afraid of that future. But why not more people who are scared are not joining the movements? Why are we still like, a handful of people, defending the forest and setting up camp and I told you about Akbelen Forest. We had camp for 3 years and we were not again successful. They destroyed the forest in 6 days. And we always say that, if we had 1,000 people walking the 15 kilometers, then maybe we would still have the forest. And so what is your take on that? Why not people are joining that movement?
I wish I had the answer. um, Maybe between all of us who are here collectively, we have the answer to that. But to me, it's a combination of things. I think one is that if you're going to cut down the forest and sell all the trees, you can make a lot of money, and you can offer people that money. You can pay people off, through bribes directly, but also through jobs and through economic development and through community benefit agreements and all these different things. Those are all forms of bribery in a sense to get people to go along. And That's the reality that we're always facing. Um, I think another piece of it is just that the propaganda is very effective. A lot of people really love technology and love modern society. And, there are parts of it that I certainly enjoy and get benefit from. Um, but many people believe in sort of the vision promoted by Elon Musk or these different techno futurists who give us these science fiction visions. So while we're doing this educational community building work here via this discussion and more broadly the People's Climate Summit, how many people are watching TikTok and YouTube and watching TV and seeing advertisements and getting indoctrinated further into consumerism and uh, a very materialistic vision of the future. So, how do we counteract that? I don't have any magic solution. I think it's just a lot of hard work. Um, Ultimately, I think these are values-driven questions, though. I don't think it's primarily about having the best facts or information. I think we're most effective when we reach people through their heart, when we get to people's values and make an emotional connection to these issues. Um, so, when I went to Russia with those climate scientists, that was back in 2010. One thing that I was very frustrated with talking with these scientists was that they seemed to have they had a very naive view of politics to me. Their view of politics was that, we're over here, we're just the scientists. Our job is to gather good information about climate change and what's happening, and we're going to present that information to the public and to politicians, and it's their job to make good decisions based on that information. And um,
They made a movie out of that. Don't Look Up, right?
yeah, yeah, basically. Um, and obviously that's not really working. So I think we need to reach people in more emotionally resonant ways, in more embodied ways, offline as much as possible. So I guess I don't have the solution overall, but one thing I will say is in a couple days here, I'm bringing, um, I've made an open invitation to people in my area to go visit an old growth forest near where I live that's threatened by logging. Um, in coming months and years. I'll share a photo of this forest here. So I'm going to bring people out to this forest and just help them to have a direct experience with nature because I think that direct experience is so much more effective than me talking to people in a lot of ways. I'm not
Okay.
that good at convincing people, but I think when you walk in a forest like that and you envision someone coming along with a chainsaw and cutting down this ancient tree, this tree is probably 500 years old. You can see it's survived wildfires. It's twice as old as the United States of America is as a country, and and it changes you in a different way than words do. So I think those
Yeah.
embodied experiences are important.
We have some questions in the chat. Suheila asks, when you showed the last slide that what you have been doing, there was a item address overshoot humanely. So can you please explain that?
Yeah, so overshoot, I don't know if people know the term overshoot. It's a technical ecology
Population.
term.
Yeah.
But overshoot is basically about carrying capacity of a given landscape. So the classic example is say you have a small island This happened in some of the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. Um, so there were these small islands. They brought in reindeer who weren't the reindeer weren't native to the islands, and they dropped reindeer there. People dropped reindeer there so that they could hunt them. And the reindeer populations grew and grew and grew and grew because there was a lot of food for them to eat and there was no predators for them. But eventually they ate all the grass and they destroyed, then they started eating the roots of the plants and they destroyed the ecology of the island. And then the population collapsed. So overshoot is basically this idea that in a given landscape, you can only support certain numbers of organisms with certain consumption habits or ways of living. And in a sense, that's true of human beings too. So, there are now more than 8 billion of us on the planet. Those of us who live in wealthy nations like me in the global north, in the United States, we have a very, very high disproportionate impact in terms of our consumption, pollution, energy use, et cetera. And the very wealthy millionaires and billionaires and trillionaires now have an even high, they have a very disproportionate impact. Um, and so overshoot is all about ecological balance, reaching ecological balance. And, people have talked about overpopulation and overshoot in the past from very racist perspectives at times, using that as a way to, try to advance their racist ideas about whatever group of people they don't like. And that's something dangerous. It's also led to, at times, things like, forced sterilization and and even direct killing of people. Um, so those are very dangerous things that we have to be aware of and guard against. But the reality is that if you want to address overpopulation in the most humane way that respects human rights and people's freedom of choice and individuality, and then the best thing you can do is educate and empower women, because where that has been done in different communities around the world, the birth rate tends to fall, environmental conditions tend to get better, impacts on ecology tend to get a lot better, and there's really no downside. You're improving everything in a positive way. Um, so, I think the climate movement and the environmental movement in general has sort of shied away from wanting to address or talk about population and overshoot in any way because of fears of being called racist or how that issue has been turned into a political hot potato, so to speak, or hot button. But I think we need to. I think we need to talk about it, and we need to do so we need to deal with these issues in ways that are serious. And a lot of ecologists would say uh, the most overpopulated countries in the world are the wealthiest countries that are consuming the most and causing the most environmental harm. So I think we need to have a very nuanced understanding of these issues. And uh, but I think we also need to not shy away from talking about them. I'm not a real expert on it, but I've been planning to interview this fellow who has been involved in, you could call it population uh, issues, but really it's like human rights work. Really, it's feminist work for many decades, working in communities that had really high birth rates and working to bring in programs of family planning and contraceptive access and education and community empowerment and so on, um, to help people there and help the ecology in the end as well. It's not a very well-known story, but uh, probably the most successful program like this in the world that has ever happened was in Iran, actually. And it was after the Iran-Iraq war, and Iran had a very high birth rate. It was something like 7 or 8 children on average per woman. And and they implemented a family planning program across the whole nation that was non-coercive. There was no, there was no authoritarianism or force involved. It was all based on education, contraceptive access, even making those services available in very remote villages and areas that weren't very accessible in those days. Um, and within just a few years, they had massive success. And it was basically, a human rights triumph for everyone involved. Um, and uh, and help them to stave off some major ecological problems that they were facing too in terms of water availability and other things. Unfortunately, now those programs have been largely dismantled. Um, and from what I understand, the Iranian government is back to encouraging people to have as many kids as possible, largely. Um, and Iran is facing an ecological crisis, of course, not just from the bombing and the effects of that, um, but they're also facing sort of a homegrown ecological crisis with water availability and drought and other issues like that. So it's not work that I've been really directly involved in myself, but there are many people who have, and I've been a big supporter of the feminist movement around the world for a long time. And I think that if we wanted to be more effective as a climate movement, I think we would kind of lean more into that feminist side and lean more into the empowerment and education of women um, as a combined human rights and environmental approach to a better future. And that's a long-term strategy, right?
Definitely.
It's meant to improve conditions and sort of gradually reduce populations as people naturally die, and not to like make it happen very quick. But it can actually have pretty quick effects because people are always, um, obviously, our time will come for all of us when we will pass on, and uh, and so when these strategies are actually implemented, then they can have a pretty big impact pretty quickly.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very delicate subject where it can turn into like a Brave New World kind of story. And but you are right that we definitely need to be talking about these difficult questions as well. And so MJ has asked, do you have a sense of the timing of collapse? Like, 5, 25, 50 years?
No, not really. Although the way that I consider it is the collapse is already happening. It's already ongoing, and it has been ongoing for a long time. Um, you know, uh, uh, Europe and Turkey and other parts of the world, uh, you know, large scale deforestation began. Europe was largely deforested by like the year 1700, 1600. Um, that's a form of ecological collapse. I think in terms of sort of the other end of it, which isn't the ecological side of the collapse, but the sort of more civilization collapse, um, look at Pakistan. Look at what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Look at the small island nations, Melanesia and or Micronesia and the Solomon Islands and the Marshall Islands and all these nations. They're collapsing. Then look at the places that are being hit by extreme weather harder and harder all the time. Um, whether it's France and Spain right now with the wildfires, the Philippines getting hammered with typhoons, seemingly stronger and more every year. Um, but if we want to talk about really the front line of collapse, Pakistan has been on my mind a lot lately in recent years because of the cyclical floods and droughts that they've been getting hit with. Um, so the way that I think of it is that collapse is a process that plays out over decades. It's not an event that just happens one day. Um, and it comes to different people in different places in different ways. So I think it's ongoing. I think we're in the middle of it. I don't know if that's helpful, but
And thank you. And Levent asks, um, from a pragmatic perspective, if you were elected as the governor of your state, what would you be your plan for degrowth?
uh, I don't think I'd get that many votes, unfortunately. Um, what would be my plan for degrowth? I don't know if I have a policy platform quite yet. But just thinking off the top of my head, I don't know if these will be the best ideas because I'm just coming up with them now. But um, I would probably begin with a pretty significant reform of taxation and I guess I'm assuming that I can't just sort of like overthrow capitalism myself. I'm sort of still embedded within the system as it exists now. Um, I would probably reform taxation a lot to have a much more progressive taxation structure. I would put that money towards job retraining to bring youth out of schools and bring workers out of extractive industries and into restoration and relocalization initiatives to focus on permaculture and food forests and land restoration. Um, I would implement programs to remove the major dams on the rivers in my area, which would have to be coupled with that produces a lot of our electricity here. So it'd have to be coupled with huge educational campaigns to about reducing energy consumption, energy efficiency upgrades to people's homes, um, and then sort of provisioning programs to build alternatives to and a high energy based way of life. Um, would probably have to develop some sort of plans for um, uh, you know restructuring our pattern of life because right now it's the big cities and then it's rural areas where people are very spread out. I think over the medium term, we probably need to move back towards more smaller scale villages. Um, the cities probably need to grow smaller, and some of the rural areas probably need to get a little more concentrated, so that people can share resources and work together in those areas. How to do that without forcing people at all is a good question. I would need help on that, but I would, start moving in that direction and developing plans to move in that direction to incentivize changes in that way. Um, uh, in terms of reducing fossil fuel use, I think I think that if you said, okay, we're going to reduce fossil fuel use by 20% this year, 20% the next year, 20% the following year, et cetera, um, then you could get pretty far. Obviously, we would want to prioritize the most essential needs for what energy we would still be using, so hospitals and things like that. Um, uh, uh, Farms and permaculture projects would need a lot more labor without the use of machines and tractors and so on. So we would need to work in that direction. There's a lot that would need to be done. A lot. I feel like that's just scraping the surface. But maybe that's a start. There's an interesting writer who goes by the name of The Last Farm, who I can share the link in the chat. This person, um, one of the things they do is sort of create these practical plans for transitionary steps towards a pretty radical degrowth future. Um, and so there's some interesting writing on that website that might help answer this question or give some ideas.
Uh, Thank you. I think you would just write some executive orders, no?
Yeah, we'll see.
Okay, yeah, yeah. And so the next one is from Deniz. She asks, there are some indigenous-led partner solar or geothermal energy projects. Do you think these examples only serve as a form of greenwashing, or do you believe it is possible for communities to use these resources responsibly through their own stewardship?
I guess it depends for me on scale and goals and culture behind it. There are a lot of communities around the world that are using very small scale solar energy um, as a form of disaster relief or to power very small scale uses of energy for a few lights and um, or medical purposes and so on. I know my friends in the Philippines, for example, have been involved in disaster relief there, and they have been using solar panels as part of that disaster relief. Um, there are people who are trying to live off grid and build communities that are disconnected from the industrial system. I wouldn't consider that, like, I wouldn't attack that. I don't feel like it's a priority to criticize that. But I do think it's important to know that these technologies are not uh,
Uh,
democratic and authoritarian techniques. And a technic is he uses the word technic to refer to not just a technology, but everything that supports that
mm,
technology. So the production processes, the culture, the education that people have to get in order to make it, the supply chains, the way that technology changes the people who use it. So that's a technic. And he said there are democratic techniques and there are authoritarian techniques. And democratic techniques are those which are small scale, anyone can create them. They both emerge from and they reinforce a culture of egalitarianism and democracy and equality and justice. And authoritarian techniques are the opposite. They both emerge from and they reinforce a culture of exploitation, of imperialism, and so on. And I think that solar panels are authoritarian techniques fundamentally. Because again, look at the mining that it takes to create them all around the world. So even if solar panels are being used for a good purpose, we still have to be very clear-eyed that they come from violence, that they're a technology of violence inherently. Because to build a solar panel, you have to blow up mountains. You have to poison water. There's no way around that. And again, that doesn't mean that I condemn everyone who uses a solar panel, but I think we have to see these things clearly. So when I see an indigenous community that is doing like commercial scale solar energy projects in partnership with energy developers or of their own volition, I hope I'm not offending people, but to me, that's a sign of assimilation into an industrial system, into a capitalist model. It's not a sign of like sort of a real uh, development emerging from indigenous values and land-oriented
mm,
ethics. That's my perspective on it. Um, am I going to attack those people? That's not necessarily going to be a priority for me, right? Because I think we have bigger problems. Um, but um, but yeah, I question it. There's a somewhat parallel thing in the U.S. where recently a tribe, the Duck Valley uh, Shoshone Paiute tribe, partnered with a mining company, a gold mining company. And it's a new type of partnership where they're actually like co-owners of the mine. And so they're getting a share of all the profits from the mine. And a lot of people, mainstream environmental organizations, environmental journalists like Grist, they wrote about this as if it's a wonderful thing, because now indigenous people are getting compensated for the destruction of their traditional lands. And in some ways, I think that's true, right? Compared to just being exploited and pushed aside, it's better. But in my perspective, I look at that and it's also, again, a sign of that um, assimilation into the industrial model. And this is how settler colonialism works.
Yes, yes,
It's a
yes.
multi-stage process. The first stage is conquest. Uh, the second stage is removal. So you remove the people from the land and you concentrate them in certain areas. This is what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, right? And then the third stage is if you can't kill them all, then you assimilate them into the settler colonial culture, and they take on the values of the settler colonial culture. Um, and um, there are a lot of traditionally oriented indigenous people who I work with who are very, very critical um, of the Duck Valley tribe, for example, and their decision to do this with the mine. Um, but I think we need to not romanticize indigenous peoples, because indigenous people are just people like anyone else. They have this certain history, they have this certain culture that we need to appreciate and understand and learn from. Um, but also, there are indigenous people who are capitalists. There are indigenous people who are fascists. There are indigenous people who are all kinds of different things, right? Um, and just because they're indigenous and they're doing something doesn't mean that it's necessarily great. So hopefully that's a nuanced answer to the question. It's challenging. It's a challenging situation for sure.
Uh, it definitely is challenging, as you said, to understand how this assimilation works. And that's why it's important, I think, to understand the concepts and how these concepts have changed our mindsets. And now we have to, think about them in a different light. And we have a different another question. So Florian asks, what's your perspective on the spiritual aspect of society to help move people in the right direction? In the West, organized religions have mostly been replaced by scientism, which is like,
Mm.
positive thinking, I think, and the values of the Enlightenment, which could be argued is quite fundamental to our current predicament. How could we help foster a new nature-centric spiritual practice that puts humans back in our place as integral part of the living world? Hmm.
That's a great question. Maybe Florian knows how to do that. Maybe you have the answer already. Um, but no, I think this is really, really important. And that's directly related to what I said earlier. I think in response to Nesha's first question, um, um, I think direct experience of the more than human world, the natural world, is key for that. I think that, um, you know, there was a survey in the UK a couple years ago where they surveyed kids under the age of 18, and the kids they asked them various questions about what they like to do, and the kids rated that they thought it was more important to have an internet connection than to have daylight. And um, we are like, kids will flippantly answer questions, so you know I think if it actually came down to it, they would probably make the right choice if they actually had to make that choice. No more daylight ever, or an internet connection. But we are so assimilated into the machine, you know. how often do you have a relationship with a wild animal? And how often do you have a relationship with your phone? How often do you touch the soil? How often do you touch plastic? Um, you know, I think that the reason why I called my newsletter biocentric is because I believe that when we have a biocentric worldview, that is a worldview that sees that the natural world, the earth, our home, the only planet known in the universe to support life, gives us everything, everything that we have, that we are entirely dependent upon this beautiful web of life for our existence. Um, and when you keep that at the core of your values, then every other decision becomes much more clear. Like the question of whether or not to create solar panels or electric vehicles, it becomes crystal clear. It becomes crystal clear, right? There's no confusion anymore about this type of question. Um, and you know, I think that I think sometimes a lot about oral histories and how, I've worked with a lot of Native American indigenous peoples here in what's now the US, also in what's now Canada. Um, and one commonality between them is what anthropologists call animism, right? Which is
Mm,
the view that nature is alive, that it is animate, that mountains have spirits, that rivers are living beings, that the wind might carry messages to us, um, uh, that spirits are throughout the whole world around us every day, all the time. And the way I really look at this is personally, on sort of a spiritual religious sense, I believe that this is true. But also, even if you set that aside and take a completely scientific worldview on animism, what do you learn? What do you see? What you see is that the only sustainable societies that have existed in human history, of which there are tens of thousands of them, have been animistic societies, more or less. They have been societies that see the living world around us as animate and important and equal to us, if not greater than us. And that tells us that animism is an adaptive trait, right? That in the process of evolution and natural selection, something about developing an animistic worldview gave a benefit to human societies and human beings. It helped us to live in balance in places around the world, from the Arctic to the Tierra del Fuego, um, from Turkey to China to Australia. Um, Communities developed a worldview that shared some similarities because it was an adaptive trait. It helped us to live in the right way. And now, as Florian said, over the last couple hundred years, this Enlightenment orientation has come about. This science-based worldview has come about, and now that has brought us many wonderful things. It has helped us understand the world in some very deep ways, but it has also led us to the brink. It has led us to this place of total destruction. And that tells me that that worldview that sees the natural world as inanimate matter for us to exploit and extract from, that is a maladaptive worldview.
mm,
It is anti-adaptive. It is anti-evolutionary for our species and for our survival in the long term. Um, so to me, does that mean we get rid of everything from science and we forget everything we learned? Not necessarily, no. But it does mean that we need to make a big pivot away from that worldview. So yeah, I completely agree, Florian, and I don't have the answer to how to get people there so easily, but I think it's essential. It's one reason why I've been a wilderness guide for a long time, because I think taking people out into wild nature where they can have a relationship with an ancient forest or the ocean or the mountains or the grasslands, um, and not be on their screen, not be with other people and distracted by the human world, but can have a direct connection with the more than human world. I think that's the pathway. So I wish I had better answers, but thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really, opening our horizons. I just have one last question before we finish, because I think we have time until 7:30 here. Um,
Naisha, Naisha, sorry to interrupt, but Ume has had their hand up here. I don't know
so
if you want to take that as well or if you could see, but sorry,
yes, Umay. Yes, please.
Ume.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for this webinar. Neşe has been talking about your book for a bit now, so it's very nice to meet you like this. Well, the discussion has arrived at a very nice place, spiritual and stuff, but I'd like to ask a question about a very sort of substantial detail. All this discussion about whether we should provide the energy from fossil fuels or green energy and so on and so forth also somehow depends upon some statistics about how much we consume. So the counter argument to what we say, where we stand at, usually, I mean, the calculation for the amount of energy that we need is done by the amount of energy we actually consume. But the amount of energy we consume and the basic amount of energy that we need might be very different. But we were speaking from Turkey, we weren't able to reach at some numbers that tell us actually not the amount of consumption, but how much basic and little amount of electricity, let's say, for example, we might actually dwell upon. And hence, we don't need just transitions, for example. We might not need as you also said that there are very problematic issues in terms of just transition as well. So if we might have an understanding, substantial and ideal wise, of the amount of energy we need to live, basically, live and let live, let's say. So the question is, did you ever come across with such numbers? I mean, hypothetical or, I mean, substantial. Did you ever come across with such numbers? I mean, the amount of consumption versus the probably much less amount of energy that we as humans need to live. In terms of advocacy, sometimes this comes very handy. So that's my question. And I had an addition to Florian's question and what you have said to answer their question. Well, some of the answers might be in biocultural diversities of all our communities and history. So we might remember and study biocultural diversities as well, I think. So that's about it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, my great question. The question you ask about how far do we need to reduce our energy use in order to get to a reasonable starting point conversation, to me, that's where reasonable debate begins, right? This question about transitioning the entire economy as it currently exists to renewable energy, to me, is just absurd. It's ridiculous. It's not a serious conversation. I quoted Vaclav Smil earlier, talking about saying this is academic science fiction, right? But if we were talking about, okay, what would it look like to reduce global energy consumption by 80%? How would we achieve that with some type of justice, some type of balance of different groups' interests, to allow some basic energy use to continue for absolute necessities? um, that to me is the starting point for a reasonable conversation. I don't have specific numbers for that, but I think from a climate perspective, I think we're talking about at least 80% globally reduction in energy use, to get to like some type of climate, towards some type of climate stability situation. But of course, climate scientists were talking about we need 80% reductions in emissions. They were talking about that like 15, 20 years ago, right? So I think we're probably past that in terms of a stopping the progression of global warming place. I think we probably need more like a 90% plus reduction in energy use. But you look at how much energy is wasted in the world today. And I think even with 10% of the energy we use, we could like run hospitals and, do a lot of basic things with that energy. Agriculture isn't that much of energy use around the world. For example, even industrial agriculture with all the destructiveness that it has. So yeah, I think that if we were trying to implement sort of like a radical degrowth coalition worldwide, then I think starting with something like a 90% reduction in global energy use with some sort of mechanisms to, even that out so the global north has greater than 90% reductions, and certain poorest areas might increase their energy consumption slightly to power basic necessities. Um, I think that might be a reasonable starting point. You know, I support people taking that position and fighting that fight. Again, for me, though, being biocentric, my my position goes a little bit further than that, looking at the technologies of authoritarianism and the costs of the energy production and so on. And it's that's not an easy situation or an easy perspective to come to. I recognize that there are a lot of moral questions about that, for example, because we're all dependent on industrial agriculture that makes all our food, and it's all fossil fuel fertilizer and fossil fuel energy running the tractors and the harvesters and so on. So we need to figure out how that transition is going to happen rapidly, because if we don't figure out a plan and do it deliberately, it's going to happen uncontrolled as the system collapses, and that's mass death and mass starvation. That's what we're headed towards. But I often think about my great grandparents didn't have cars, and my great grandparents certainly didn't grow up with electricity. They had hard lives. Their lives weren't perfect by any means. They were very difficult in some ways, in many ways. But they survived, and they had joy. They had friends. They had family. They had things that they loved. They had a community. They had purpose. My friend, Chief Kayleen Sisk from the Winnemem Wintu tribe, which is a tribe in what's now California. She is in her 60s, and she grew up with no electricity. There are many, many people alive today who don't have electricity currently, or who grew up without electricity and now have only a small amount of it available. And I guess the point that I'm making is we often think about these products of modernity as things that we need. We need electricity. We need the internet. we need cars, we need the ability to transport ourselves, whether it's with trains or planes or whatever. We need this rapid transportation across the planet. But the reality is for 95%, probably 99% of our time on this planet as a species, we didn't have any of that. And we had good and meaningful lives in that time. We lived, we lived, and we lived in many cases beautiful lives. And so I think it's a mistake to think of these things as necessities. They are necessities now for some people, and that we've become dependent on them. But that dependence is not forever necessarily. So it's a challenging answer, because once we get into this discussion, there's always going to be trade-offs and conflicts and difficulties and cases that are very challenging. One of my best friends right now is going through a terrible illness, and he's only alive because of industrial medicine and electricity and modern things that support his ability to be alive for now. He won't last very long, and that's very, very difficult. It's very difficult with the industrial medicine, and without it, he probably would have passed on already. I wouldn't be alive right now without industrial medicine. And those get into those areas where I was talking about what can we keep from the scientific worldview? What can we keep from the industrial system that we've learned that can be adapted to a much lower energy, more localized way of life? And I think there are ways to do those things in many cases, where we maintain some of the advancements in public health and lower infant mortality and water quality and these different things in a much different context than we have now. I wish I had a better perfect answer to this, but I don't.
Well, yes, Süheyla says if there wasn't any internet, then we wouldn't be able to meet you in person. So I agree with that. And there are some comments on the chat. I don't know if you are able to read them. Oswald says we are at a decisive time. Climate events are becoming increasingly extreme across the world. There are wildfires, heat waves, causing loss of human life and destroying nature. And so these COP conferences are not delivering the necessary responses because fossil fuel corporations and petrostates are blocking climate action. I believe we must conceive new approaches and strategies for struggle. We must help people to prepare for climate impacts, like the global El Nino phenomenon is approaching with great force and will drive the planet's temperature even higher. So he says, I believe it is crucial to declare that the planet is in a state of emergency. And we must outline the structural changes that are required and prepare citizens to take part in transforming their relationship with the planet. I have a comment on that, if you let me. I think we should really, as Oswald says, we should reconnect with nature again. I mean, for example, we are so used to drinking bottled water, so we lost where this water comes from. So if this water was coming from a well that was, dug by our grandfather, then we would know that when the water is, getting lower, or if the taste of the water is changing. So we would, take precaution for it. But now we don't know where our water is coming from. It's just, coming bottled water. And so we lost that connection between where our food is coming from, where our water is coming from. So I think we first may start with connecting what we eat and what we drink with the natural environment, what we have. And so this is my take on it. I have one last thing that I would like to ask you. In bright green lights, you have a green spectrum from dark green
Mm,
to transhuman,
mm.
and there are some, like bright green people. So that was like really the eye-opening stuff. So when I was inviting people to this webinar, I used the teasing. I said, which green are you? Dark green or bright green, or you know what? So maybe you would like to say, yeah, that's it. That's the one.
Yeah, sure. So this is just a conceptual tool. It's a map that we came up with to think about the spectrum of environmentalists. So on one end, we have the technocrats and the transhumanists who want to leave the Earth behind, like Elon Musk, go to Mars and go elsewhere. And ultimately, these people want to upload the human mind into machines and become machines, essentially. Um, it's crazy to me. um, then you have, cornucopians who think the Earth is essentially infinite. Here, let me see. Can I make this bigger for you all? Um, these are the people who think that the Earth is infinite and that technology will solve all environmental problems. Um, environmental managers are the people who just believe that regulation and management and natural resource regulations can allow us to continue to exploit the world uh, forever, essentially. And then you have bright greens. Bright greens are the people um, who are really focused on renewable energy, on electric vehicles. They believe that climate change is very real, that it's very serious, but they think that green technology and ethical consumerism can allow us to maintain, an industrial modern society forever. Very human-centric worldview. Um, and then you have lifestylists who they believe environmental serious problems are very serious, but they're focused on personal action, very focused on personal action. They don't really believe in political action. Um, and those there are many of those people, including friends of mine. I have friends sort of I have friends in all these groups to some extent, maybe not the bottom ones. And then deep greens or deep ecologists, who see humans as one form of life on this planet, no more or less important than any other, and who really see that we have to live within the limits of ecology in order to thrive on this planet. And so transformation has to occur across all these levels. So obviously this is simplified. It doesn't cover everyone. But it's like any map. It's not as complex as the reality. There are people who fall across all these spectrums. But it can be a helpful tool to think about and understand where people are coming from. Um, yeah, for me, it helps me to understand who are my allies and who are
Thanks.
not in a given
Yeah.
situation and why. And it helps me to understand why they believe what they believe and then how to respond to that situation. So thanks, Nisha. Oh yeah, I'll share that
Thank
in the chat.
you. Yes, thank you. That was really great. We I will share the biocentric link. Maybe you can also put it in the link, so we can all follow you and maybe communicate you through uh, in other media. Thank you for joining us today. It was great. Maybe we will come up with other topics like the one you did the other day, like AI and
Mm.
surveillance, and so let's keep in touch.
Thank you, Nisha. Thanks everyone for being here and really appreciate y'all taking the time and the interpreters too. I know that's hard work. Thank you. Hopefully I don't talk too fast.
Çok teşekkür ederiz herkese katıldığınız için. Yeni bir webinarda görüşmek üzere. Sevgiler, hoşça kalın.
Bye, everyone.